who's a staff economist at the Competition and Markets Authority, and he's certainly that's been really specialised in during the pandemic and non-policy. And he's a teacher in economics from UCL. And we also have Dr. Andrea Renda, and he's joining us here from the Complexity Science of Vienna, the Great of Kennedy's Group. And she's postdoctoral research fellow at James. And she worked predicting on Asian data modeling, and we focus on their reference. So as our first speaker, we'll have Tony Person.
Great, thank you for inviting me, Laura, and this is a great opportunity to cover these important topics. I have a slide, which is a single slide, which is just the summary of what I'm going to say. That's the one, so that if I get completely lost, you can kind of look lost. I can try and do something about it. So, as Laura said, I spent a lot of the time during the pandemic between the Cabinet Office and Number 10, and as everyone was, kind of generally trying to find where to be helpful in a very difficult, sometimes chaotic situation. So my reflections on data, I want to talk about this. Firstly, there was a sort of narrative arc of what we thought was going to happen, what we did, and what did happen around the use of data and models. So firstly, I think that it's fair to say February, March, April, enormous amounts of excitement, intellectual excitement about what was going to be possible. I think that all of us at the quantitative end of social sciences had a very strong sense that we knew that there were incredibly powerful data sets out there, that the context of a crisis meant that the usual blockages would be easier to overcome, and that there was just going to be an enormous, so there was a genuine sense of what could we do. It was going to be very exciting for a lot of us, and me included, getting our heads around public health issues and epidemics, which hadn't been certainly for me something completely foreign at the time. That excitement led to a certain amount of building, and, for example, the work that we're going to hear about, which from the Institute of New Economic Thinking, which in my mind was absolutely the best piece of economics work that I saw coming out of that period of excitement and building. But ultimately, we also had, I think, there was a kind of great disappointment, which I think settled in maybe from June onwards, that this was not measuring up to the promise. And I want to spend most of my 10 minutes on why didn't it measure up to the promise. So there was some great stuff, and there's some fantastic work, but I do want to focus on this question of the disappointment. So very shortly on the excitement. So at the beginning, what we thought was, okay, so we're going to get some very sophisticated work on how on epidemiology, on how viruses work. We're going to do some of the things which are at the cutting edge on how economies and humans work, and we're going to bring them together in these in new ways. And whether it was INET or some of the tech companies started coming to us saying, look at the data we have, how we can think about this and do this. Smart MPI, the thinking around smart MPIs at the beginning of the pandemic, very, very exciting. The policy thinking was very exciting. We knew, all of a sudden we're wide open. One of the big, what I want to talk about mostly, and there was lots of doing, it's very interesting. I want to talk about the NHS app a little bit. And some of you in the UK will remember the NHS app. The NHS, NHSX, NHS Digital very quickly got to work, helped by some academics, to building the app. And that was going to be, in a sense, absolutely central to a central background assumption to a lot of the smart MPI thinking. It was that we were going to be able to use real-time data, and that real-time data was going to be passively collected through behavior, and we would enable this through the app. And there was a sort of sense in which, you know, if the technology is so good at pinpointing us for advertising purposes, the technology is there for public health purposes. We can do this. Okay? We just need to work out exactly how we're going to do it. And at this point, some of you will remember the media story around this. There was app development, there was a trial, the trial was on the Isle of Wight. Then stories started coming out that the app wasn't quite working, it was draining people's phones, etc., etc. And at the same time, Apple and Google started saying, no, wait, you don't want to be doing this, we can do this. In the background, and much less picked up, was that in March 2020, Apple fundamentally changed an element of its operating system in that a low power Bluetooth mode, something which allows Bluetooth to just send a little ping out very occasionally to see whether there's another device around it that wants to have a chat. That feature, which had been available to developers before March 2020, became available only to Apple. Okay, so that was that little feature of, can I ping and see whether there's someone there? Can I do it in a very low power way without waking up the whole device or having the listening device away? It's absolutely fundamental to having a viable app. And it was simply switched off in March 2020. Not great fanfare or anything like that. Okay. It essentially meant that it was impossible, it became impossible for us, you know, whether it was right to do so, whether we decided to do so or not, etc., is the secondary question. But it was simply technically impossible then for us to collect interaction data that had locational data. Okay, so at the same time as switching this off, Google and Apple published their protocol for how apps were going to, how tracking was going to work. It was extreme. They were kind of at the libertarian end of privacy treatment in their protocol, in that it was entirely decentralized. The data collected would only be sufficient data to alert the person who was possibly infected, that they should then go and do something. So the absolute minimalist, most privacy focused, and particular concept of privacy focused development. Whereas, as you know, designing smart MPIs, almost the first thing that you come to realize is you want to say, well, we want to know, at the very least, where people are getting infected. Now, you know, you can find out where people are buying Adidas sneakers. We could not find out where people were getting infected. And we still don't know, right? I mean, for all the amazing statistical work that was done, we still don't know the locations where people were getting infected. And that wasn't because of a technical impossibility, it was because of a corporate decision. Now, we can ask all sorts of questions about why, all sorts of interesting hypotheses. I certainly don't claim to have them. Of course, Apple is very intent for its devices to become health devices. So obviously there's a market protection point. Apple's also very intent on making sure that we don't come to believe that its devices are surveillance devices. It wants that conception of privacy. And therefore, we can see all sorts of corporate reasons why it might have gone in that direction. I've no idea what the reasons were. What I know is that we never found out where people were getting infected, and that was an absolutely critical part. Now, I just want to briefly say something about, so firstly, just to make the obvious point, it seems to me that such fundamental decisions need to be democratic decisions, not corporate decisions made in, not only corporate decisions and only representing corporate interests, whatever they were. I think that, but I also then want to say, okay, this goes beyond. I mean, this was a glaring example of it, right? Of a corporate decision around data policy and privacy, which had enormous social consequences. This goes beyond COVID and beyond crises. It seems to me that one of the reasons that, you know, in March 2020, when Apple did this, there wasn't the world over and throughout public institutions an outcry saying, Apple, you can't do this. This is not how you behave in a crisis. The reason that that wasn't there is that actually, as societies, we're not really ready to deal responsibly with the social uses of data. We oscillate between privacy libertarianism that has been very much taken on by the current corporate data monopolists, and kind of scare stories about state capture of data, Orwellian state capture of data, and Chinese models of control around data. We oscillate between these two, and we don't yet know how to make use, non-commercial, non-advertising use of this extraordinary thing, which is a society which can measure itself in real time. And that's a much bigger social problem that we have to deal with. And when the next crisis comes, we'll be just as unprepared and just at the mercy of minuscule technical decisions, unless in the meantime, we make sure that we've had the democratic social conversations and decisions around the responsible uses, the social good of data.
Thank you very much. I unfortunately didn't introduce Gideon, who's also here. That's Gideon Onayanga, who's Professor of Public Policy Administration at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Nairobi. So I wish to welcome as well. And I think that you want to just think the thing on the next will be hearing from Green.
Thank you for the nice introduction, and also thank you, Tony, for mentioning our work. It means a lot. And I have to echo what you say. I'll talk a bit of a different perspective on what we did, but I just have to say, when I started my PhD, I remember my PhD advisor was talking a lot about gathering data, and I thought, I'm a physicist. I don't want to do this data gathering. I just want to do the smart modeling. At some point, you realize that we're at a moment where if you have really good data, it's valued a lot more than any brilliant modeling any physicist could think of. And for sure, and I'll talk about it, you always need good data and you need good modeling due to behavior change. And that's always going to be crucial. But I just want to echo what Tony said. And I think this is something we cannot no longer, between private companies. With that, I'll talk a bit about, so in the next slide, I will say, I think the 4 things we need for pandemic preparedness. One is data. The other is out of equilibrium and economics, interdisciplinary research, and doing explainability and predictability. So if we go to the next slide, please. Sorry. I'll maybe it's easier if I switch because I will go through slides like crazy. Okay, because I'm gonna go like crazy. Fine. So the first work we did is on supply and demand on shocks, and we asked who can work remotely, what jobs can be done essential, and what services will decrease. We did this data driven. We had it out by 15th of April, and the reason we could do it is because we were familiar with the data. We knew a simple approach, and we did it. And in this plot, you can see nodes are occupations, and you can see the labor shock. Negative means they cannot work due to not being able to work from home, due to essentials, and also due to demand, right? So transport was essential, but no one was traveling that much, so it also had a huge hit. The horizontal axis is wage, the vertical axis is shock. And striking, you see airline pilots are the only occupation that's rich that is affected. And also they're colored by fear of infection. So you can see at the top, even those poor occupations that are not affected, they're more likely to be exposed to the virus. So in one plot, fully data driven, you already knew poor people are going to be affected the most, and the ones that are not going to be affected are going to get infected. That was the first plot. But that's only a shock, right? And then I'm going to talk about out of equilibrium economics. That's the other thing we need. For those of you who are not familiar, the way econ, and I'm gonna, puppet show it a bit. So apologies if I'm offending anyone. I have a huge respect for a lot of the work that's done in economics, but in a nutshell, equilibrium means the world is in a state where no agent has an incentive to modify the chosen action. We're perfect. There comes a shock like the COVID-19 pandemic. Everyone thinks a lot. They solve utility maximization. They optimize what they're going to do, and we reach the next equilibrium. And if anyone was during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was absolutely an external shock, we didn't reach an equilibrium immediately after. But it took a long time, and we were over and over doing it. So what we need is, we need a framework where you actually have agents interacting, do a decision, next day, do a decision, next day, do a decision. And that's what they did. So in the next slide, we used a network of production where nodes were industries, they received input and output at each day. They could produce if they got enough inputs. If they had labor shortage, they couldn't produce, and that would spill on. And we did it day by day. No utility maximization, simple rules of you try to produce as much as you can with what you have. And these were the results. So on the next slide, sorry if you can, thanks. Here is time, impact of the lockdown on the UK economy. Black is what our model would forecast. The dots are what really happened. We're talking that our model said a decrease in GDP of 21.5%, and the realized was actually 22 point something. So we can also talk about, there was a bit of luck, whatever, it still worked. And it was done quickly. And one thing I want to, there are a lot of people that predicted roughly accurately this. The one thing we did a lot better was going in the next slide, please. We see at the industry level. So we predicted for which industry, what would happen. On the horizontal axis, you have the data. On the vertical axis, the prediction. If we were on the identity line, it would be perfect. Of course, we have errors, but they're roughly spot on. And this was done by 2 PhD students, 3 early career postdocs, and a supervisor. And we just did what we could with the data we had. And I think one thing that was there is we were the only ones trying with this approach, right? A lot of economists were done on equilibrium, which always brings a lot of analysis, but sometimes it's just about trying, to having the data, getting your hands dirty and doing it out. And this is also why I think we need interdisciplinarity. And now let me go through economics and epidemics. This work came out a lot later. That's also because we're not really used to interdisciplinary research as much as we like talking about it. We're not used to it. So it took a while for us to be in contact with epidemiologists, and we finally worked it out. So in the next slide, please, we have an economic model. So that's all what we do is called agent-based models, which are computer simulations. They're data-driven. We have some behavior and we simulate it. The same was done by epidemiologists. It was actually one thing I love is, they say math is the language of science. I think right now it's coding. Because the way we interacted was through coding. And it's because they did agent-based models, they knew how to code. We did agent-based models, we knew how to code. We went through a spreadsheet, and that's how we interacted. And here what you see is that here we analyze the health economy trade-off. And what's really sad is that there is a trade-off. So here we tested different policies. So for example, on the left side, you see all industries open, closing only the ones that are customer service facing, and then all non-essential. And you see infections and unemployment. You see infections going down as you close the economy, unemployment going up as you close the economy. So there is a trade-off. The other thing you see is that the lines, the orange one is low income, the blue one is high income. So the trade-off is borne by the poor. It's the poor that are going to get more infected, but it's also the poor that are going to get more unemployed. And this is also something you can test due to the data. So this is the summary of the 3 works we did. And yeah, so just to wrap up and maybe also discuss a bit. We need the data, we need out of equilibrium, we need interdisciplinary research, and interdisciplinary research, it's something every grant you write, everything it's there, everyone wants it. But what they're talking about is being in a discipline and flirting a bit with the other disciplines, taking this from here, taking here from there. If you're in the middle of two disciplines, and our group has been, between computer science, mathematics, and economics in the middle, first thing I realized, the two disciplines are ages away. Like they're just far apart. It's like communicating with one another is like super, super different. And we need to start doing interdisciplinary research. We actually have people in the middle. And going back to, why was this a disappointment? I'm super proud, and thanks Tony for saying like, this work was really nice and it was great. And I have to say we were able to work so often because Penny, my collaborator, was in Australia. So I was working all day. I would send her to her at night. She would work all night, send it to me in the morning, and we're collaborating 24/7. And when I see the impact the work had, I'm really proud of it. I love it. But I also feel like, why were there not a lot more people doing this? And why were we not prepared? And true, I think there's a big part that's on data, and I'd love to talk a lot more about it. But I think there's also not enough people. And even if the data was there, we don't have the people that are ready to say, ready, set, go. And the moment we have the people, I think we will also have a lot more push for having all that data. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. The unusual way we're deciding who speaks next.
Yeah, you can skip all of those. Okay, yeah, it could be like I really just oh my god, sorry. I recycle a lot of slides, so just go through them.
It's very fascinating.
Time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think a lot of Periscope work is about Europe. So when I was invited, I was like, how am I fitting in Europe? I'm an African doing African research. So, and I was confident told that no, it is about these global trends on how COVID and the experiences of COVID-19 and policy issues and data issues. So as you have been introduced, I'm Gideon. I serve as a research officer here at the Institute of Lalji Institute of African Studies. I'm also teaching at the University of Nairobi, Department of Political Science, and I'm also a co-country investigator with the Afrobarometer in Kenya. So right now I'm wearing the hat of Afrobarometer representative, and I'm bringing to you how Africans experienced COVID, or the data we collected in 2022 concerning what I call COVID governance in Africa. The data is very huge, but I just selected a bit of it that might be of interest to us and with regard to this theme of this particular conference. So I'm focusing on different issues here. We have issues of vaccination response in Africa, and that is the data as per country. I mean, going to other variables, I just look at the countries and how they responded to vaccination in that time, especially in 2022 and the period after COVID, beginning 2021, mid 2021. And this data was collected differently in different countries. Others collected it by March 2022, others collected it earlier 2021. So there's variation to that collection. So as you can see the variation there, most Africans received vaccination depending on the country. And we see Mauritius did very well in regard to vaccination response, where 95.3% received vaccination, while countries like Cameroon did very poorly, where 60% have not been vaccinated. What is the reason behind this? We'll see more elaboration on that. So when people asked if a vaccine was to be given today, or if it's available, how likely are they going to be vaccinated? We're looking at these issues of hesitancy, because there has been a lot of report about people not going to get the vaccine, and this is data that came out where blue says that it's not applicable to them. That blue part, the bar, that blue bar shows that it was not applicable to them. The yellow bar shows that they were somewhat likely to have that vaccination. The red one shows that they were very likely to do it or somewhat unlikely to do it. And that's the data that we have there as per country, seeing that Sierra Leone 65.4% and Tunisia 85.9% saying that it is not applicable to them. There are a lot of reasons that were given behind this. Some stated that COVID-19 was not, when you see the majority of responses here, a lot of responses were like, the vaccination was developed very quickly, or the vaccine was not safe, or the vaccine caused some other repercussions. Some even thought that it would cause infertility. There was a lot of narratives around the effect of the vaccine. And if we look at this data, we find that most Africans thought that either the vaccine, the reason why there was hesitancy towards vaccination was that either it was not safe, or it was developed too quickly, or it could cause other effects to them. And that's what explains that that data that we see there. I'm sorry that it is a lot to consume at a go, but because of time, we just have to move. We can share more of it as we go. Another reason why around issues of COVID also regarded the response of the government with regard to the relief assistance. And we see that there was a lot of problems as far as the relief assistance was concerned. So when people were asked whether they received the relief assistance, this was in forms of either food, cash payments, relief, or bill payments. We see that in Sierra Leone, 94% said yes, said no, and 4% did not receive the relief. And you see, largely the data shows that there was no relief received by majority in that country, depending on the countries we've selected here, with only 60% in Senegal doing better, where majority of people received relief after the COVID, followed by Mauritius at 47%. Then we have Togo at 37%. The rest did not receive these reliefs. And when it comes to fairness of distribution, we also see that. We see that 45% in Mauritius said that they somewhat think that the relief was fairly distributed. The rest feel that it was either somewhat unfair or was not unfair at all, was unfairly distributed in most cases. So how did the governments manage COVID? What do people think? That how do people think that the government will manage the issues of COVID? If you look at the data, it varies across countries, with Togo thinking that COVID was fairly managed by the government compared to other countries. Kenya also think that COVID was fairly managed, and also Benin think that it was fairly managed. Others are neither here nor there. But Sierra Leone is a very interesting case study, because they say more than half say that it was very well managed. So we don't understand the reasons behind it, but more investigation can tell us what is ongoing in those countries and why we have these variations. So with regard to satisfaction on the issues of facilities and how the government avail these facilities or the effectiveness of these facilities, we see that like the Gabon, is it Gabon or Tunisia? But we see the variation. We can see the data, how it runs. There is not so much issues, trust in the effectiveness of the health facilities, with the majority falling below 50% in their responses, whether it is somewhat effective or somewhat very effective. We see the pink colors are at 38 who are in support of the health system. Sierra Leone actually leading at 47%. Then, considering the funds resources that were available to the government combating the COVID-19, how much do you think was lost to stolen corruption? Issues of accountability, we know that are very pertinent in the African government systems. And this is the answer. We see that there's a lot of government mistrust, where we see that a lot of people, especially in Tunisia, think that a lot of money was lost in corruption. Uganda also think that 67.4% that a lot of money was lost in corruption. But there is generally low trust when it comes to issues on how the funds were distributed when it comes to the management of COVID-19. With a lot of distrust, we see Kenya is leading at 73%, and for a good reason. Then how much trust? Now we come there. You think that the government, the question was, how much do you trust the government to ensure that any vaccine for COVID-19 is developed or offered to citizens is safe before it is used? And this is the issue. So we tie back to the issues of public trust, with the Gabon saying that 60% of Gabon, I don't know whether that's the right way of calling them, 60% saying that not at all to that particular question. And then the last one, issues of investment. I saw there was a lot of that in other discussions. Whether do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Our government needs to invest more of our health resources in special preparation for the response to health emergencies like COVID, even if it means fewer resources are available for other health services. And this is the response where the Togo people 46.5%, but they almost half think that the government should do that, while Cote d'Ivoire 52% think that there should be more investment, while others vary in the other states. I think I will stop there given the time, but that is the last update. After experiencing COVID pandemic, how prepared or unprepared do you think governments are in dealing with the future public health crisis? Lesotho is leading by saying that the government is very unprepared, and we see that the data paints a picture of the government not being very prepared for the future COVID response, except in countries like Niger, where they feel that the government is somewhat prepared. Countries like Tunisia and Benin, where countries are relatively to be prepared towards COVID-19. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
I'm going to go from the mayor.
You mind if I say there?
Yeah.
Sorry about the medium with changing my slides. Slides. Nope, I think okay. Find it up here, but
It's like,
it's okay. Well, then I can. Well, I can speak for that. So I'll get this dash map on and go with the flow. So I'm Andrea Renda, assistant professor of bioengineering at the University of Pavia in Italy, and I think I'm the only representative, together with Laura, and was also involved in the Periscope project, which is Congress takes its name from, so I think my role here is to say that the Periscope aimed at being a very data-centric project, exploring the effects of the pandemic, both on the health perspective, but also on the economics and societal levels during the pandemic. Of course, this is a project that was funded by the European Commission, so its focus is rather on the EU 27 states and affiliates, but there have been a few initiatives, including the Corona. There's been one of the central ones that I'll detail in a second, that actually had a global focus. So I think Well, the Periscope project is in its last year, so we've built much of the infrastructure that we promised we would, and I think we're kind of wrapping up the lessons learned in events like this one or the ones we'll have in September in Brussels. And what I wanted to say here is that we've seen many examples of how data was leveraged to improve or at least to try to have an impact on the pandemic, and how it evolved over time. So the vision of Periscope, and in particular what we did in one of the work packages, building what we call the Periscope data atlas, was to try have this small, well, it wasn't small, but this initial proof of concept that if we built a platform, not just something isolated, one very deep and valuable analysis on one subset of data that could be super relevant for a local environment or at the global scale. But if we just built a platform that would help us, use COVID as a use case to show that if we had the data, if we had the access, and if the data was integrated, and if we had the right interdisciplinary viewpoint on this, we could have done much better. And the mission of the project is also to leave this artifact at the end of the project, so that it is a convincing use case that it could have worked better if we just did this beforehand, right? So with this in mind, well, Periscope is many things, but one of the things that we did was actually building such a platform, and we called it the Data Atlas. And the Data Atlas is, first of all, a big data integration piece of software, where, because to really understand the complexity of the pandemic and the shock it brought to society and health, one angle is not enough. So one of the central efforts was a collection about data about policies, these non-pharmacological interventions, and that was led by colleagues at Technical University of Munich, which have been funded through the Periscope initiative with the CoronaNet project, and they have an extensive and huge and very, very detailed data collection about policies that were put in place by different governments worldwide, even if they have better, more granular data on Europe. Their effort of data collection is really worldwide, in response to the COVID pandemic, right? And that's a very important asset. And there's been other initiatives like the Oxford Tracker and others that have done something similarly, but the CoronaNet data was really an asset that we could leverage to really understand the policymaking side of things. Even because it was really a trial and error kind of process to reach this equilibrium that we maybe reached at the very end, or maybe not. And so very precise tracking of each decision that was taken by central, federal, or even local governments, because this was done in a multi-level fashion, has been central to all the analysis we were able to make. Then another central piece is integration of such data, right? Because if you work in silos, either disciplinary silos, but also data silos, things are so much more difficult, right? And you can only have a partial view of the phenomenon. So we also try to integrate both technically and, more importantly, also semantically, because different disciplines talk different languages, and different contexts have slightly different takes on the same underlying concepts. So another thing that we did was integrate this policy data with data about health. So the well-known indicators that we all became suddenly familiar with, and data about economics. And that data you know, not everything has to be collected from scratch. There are very important initiatives by the OECD and the European Center for Disease Control or the CDC in the US. You name it, and we've seen the Afrometer. So we try to pull this all together and integrate in one semantically sensible repository. Okay, and the idea is that this is fed periodically so that the data stays up to date. And on top of that, we also had the other work packages that leveraged what we built as a platform to then go in with their super important research question, either from the economics point of view or the health point of view. We had epidemiologists on the project. We had economists in LSE and TUM. And we had statisticians, so people that are experts in modeling. And the idea was to really create a virtuous cycle where, you know, we could output quality studies and try to answer these relevant questions that were emerging. Okay, so this is what we did. It all boiled down also to, well, the infrastructure itself, but also a set of hopefully easy to use interfaces for policymakers that allow, you know, geographical exploration of the data or, you know, temporal analysis of trends and to overlay there the important events that are the policies in every case. And we try to do it both at the global scale, but that is also scalable to the very detailed and granular local data. And for local data, we had 2 use cases in Pavia, which is where my institution is from, and sadly is well known because the first official public case in Europe was diagnosed there, and in Paris, thanks to the partnership with APHP, so the network of 39 hospitals of the municipality of Paris. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, please have a look at our data atlas. It's linked and publicly available, of course, for free from the Paris Group website. And I'll be happy to discuss with the other parties. Thank you.
And now we'll have a chance for a discussion with the audience, so I'll be asking the questions from the audience in a moment. But since I'm chair, I thought I would ask this question. So it's very important, obviously, to think of evidence and data landing in a particular social field of decision making, right? So evidence and data only travels when there are decision makers who are interested in that data. And I was very struck that Maria was telling us that it was quite clear, you know, right at the beginning of the pandemic, that your data was showing that those with the lowest wages would be hardest, both by epidemiology and by, you know, their exposure. And then on the other hand, Tony was saying that we didn't quite get the data we needed, right, in the cabinet office to know really how people were infected. And so this, and of course, Afrobarometer is, you were both trying to speak to decision makers, but Afrobarometer and Anea's work was really speaking to the broader public as well. It was looking inwards towards decision makers as well as outwards towards the public itself. So that leads me to a couple of questions. The first one is, when your pioneering work did travel and did work, what was it about the social field that meant that it was picked up? What, you know, why was it the decision makers picked up when they did? And also, is your data intended only for decision makers, or do you see your work as leading to a more open access that could create more democratic debate in society during pandemics about what was going on? So basically, the question is, you know, evidence for what in the room? I'm sure.
Look, actually, it's very similar to a question that was asked at the end of the last session in this room about you know, politics and advice. And it seems to me that, I mean, you know, advice is politics, and politics is a battle, and that battle happens at every stage. the wonderful modeling that came from the INET group was it, yes, it certainly established those big points, and I don't think that those were in doubt. I guess when I talked about we didn't have the data, it's that you have to go one step further and you say, okay, so what are we going to operationalize out of that? Now, it'd be unfair to say that the awareness of the impact of lockdowns on people's income wasn't understood. That's indeed why those who could afford it implemented generous furlough schemes. Right, and again, we don't have to be naive about why those generous furlough schemes happen. People wouldn't have been able to pay their mortgages, there would have been a financial crash, etc. So that was under, what the promise in the really wonderful detailed input-output supply chain work that INET did. The promise was that we were going to be able to do the famed smart MPIs. So we were going to, whether not enough done, etc. But nevertheless, people were, there was going to be massive redistribution. Of course not enough. But the promise of the data was that we were then going to be able to get off that immediate shock of the 21% fall in GDP. And we were going to be able to do some clever things. And for that, we needed something at an operational level. So you needed to be able to say, well, not just analytically, how does this fall through, but practically, what policy can we put in place? For example, can directors of public health be empowered with the information to say, there's a problem here, go and do something about it? Well, that's data which in principle we could have had and we never got our hands on. So I guess that there's a question about analysis and decision making where I totally see that, I mean, where this sort of stuff is very important. And by the way, it's always a battle. So you might feel frustrated that there wasn't enough redistribution. Officials are constantly arming themselves with data in order to make points from all directions, right? The battle happens at every point, which is why I totally agree with what was said in the last section about, the battle happens when you bump into someone in the corridor and you know that you're trying to land a point with them and you collar them and you say this, I know this. Right? That's the institutional reality of decision-making, particularly in crises. And I think that one needs to realize that there are sort of many levels of impact to be had, all the way from understanding the big picture, which you certainly did, but then to operationalizing solutions completely, you need much more than that.
I completely agree. So I think we at TINET were also disappointed that we couldn't provide policymakers with more detailed actions. We did say poor people will be affected, there will be more affected. We did say if you open manufacturing, there might be less, you'll receive a huge boost in economic output. There will be some in epidemics. We weren't expert at that. We said probably not as much. That's what we could say. We couldn't say more than that. And we couldn't say more than that because we didn't have the data. Let me give an example. So we looked with this input output network I showed, 52 industries, that's the whole economy. You look at manufacturing of vehicles, it's just one node. In reality, it's a lot of firms all over the place, right? And this is something we've been insisting for a very long time. We need firm level data. Like we could have said, if you have, here's the data, open here, open there. Intersectionality. Did we say much about gender, race, ethnicity, geography? No, we don't have that data. This, Scandinavian countries have this amazing data set where you can follow people through the labor market. We have it, right? There's also in developing countries, Brazil also has that data. So yeah, I just have to say, I do think with the data we had, we did a lot and we were able to say something. but we could have said a lot more. The data was there, it was for decision makers, there was a lot of people also building up on this. But yeah, I have to say, that's it, like, if we want to do more, we need more data. And it is a bit underwhelming to see private companies have it and researchers don't.
I think it's also that hierarchy, because there are so many, epidemiological social health studies that would show, the gender effects, and quality data was really showing up really interesting patterns like rates of infection in the outsourced factories in Leicester, for example. You could pick that up at the local level from public health data if you did ethnography as well. But that kind of data wasn't looked at in number 10, as far as I can tell. It wasn't rising up the hierarchies of knowledge.
I mean, just to jump in, I think there's a question about speed here and the speed. So you mentioned how fast you were. You were unbelievably fast with your modelling. But one of the things at the time was that you knew that so with Leicester, and obviously Leicester was the subject of many conversations. But the power of being able to say, actually, we can tell where people are getting infected in Leicester, and they're getting, it's moving from these workplaces to these homes, or whatever the story actually was. The power of being able to say that is, there's a sort of, if we'd been able to say that, there's an undeniability to it, which is very different from a well-judged inference. Well, we know this in general about this bit of this bit of the economy, this bit of society, etc. There is evidence about the way in which these work, etc. That it's a very different weight to be able to refer to something. This is what's going on now. That to be able to do that has a very different weight in those contexts of decision making.
That's what the evidence was that we were supplying them with, ethnographic evidence, precisely what was going on in Leicester. But
where was that coming from? How were you collecting it?
Research, online research, knowing basically talking to the local public health officer about, in real time about the areas that he already knew there were health problems. It's not like local public health officers didn't have maps of where the greatest health problems were. And of course, where there are greatest health problems, that people would still be more likely to suffer bad effects from COVID. There would be greater transmission there, where there was crowded housing, even the multiple indices of deprivation would work with that, as well as local public health records with ethnographic work to kind of track in real time what was going on. And I mean, that's what we were trying to do in the social listening project that we were doing with LSE and COVID and care group. But I'm kind of interested, I mean, this is a huge conversation, but I want to bring in Gideon and Ed here, because of course you had your audience was policymakers, but it was also the public, and both of you. And maybe you can talk about what it was like to be in that intermediary position, and where your evidence has traveled to and made a difference, maybe either in public conversations or in policy.
Thank you very much. It is very challenging to answer that question in the context of African countries that are largely under the aid regime. What happened with the issue of evidence and COVID response in Africa is something that is very interesting, because it also took up these international political relations. And there are some countries that in their response viewed the instructions or the policies that are being given to them by WHO to implement. Some of them, they took it with the suspicion and were looking inward to find a way or the local solutions to their own problem. And also, these countries were, COVID-19 also came into the context where the governments were also still struggling with more pertinent issues, where perhaps COVID-19 was not the priority. And this one came out very clearly in the case of Tanzania, where the president actually just stated that there is no lockdown. Their priority is the economy. And in the next 2 years, while all countries are in lockdown, the Tanzanian economy will be able now to supply food to the entire region in that particular area. So the issues of evidence use and the response to COVID-19, however, they were there because like in the case of Kenya, we saw the president was very intentional, but he was also still caught in between hurting the economy by ensuring lockdown because the economy is alive, there's a lot of informality. The informal sector is very, very huge. Majority of the citizens survive in this informal sector. So when you close it, when you lock it down, it will mean that you'll have to find effective alternative sources of income for these people who are surviving on hand-to-mouth basis every day. So they were caught up between taking the data and exercising authority on it, or finding their own solutions that were feasible, depending on the issues that were more pertinent at that particular time. And that's why, like in areas like Uganda, and what Melissa was saying, and the team has also been talking about, we realize that in areas where they thought that perhaps this kind of crisis, post-national crisis, then automatically the military took it over. And because the military has more expertise and is more, rather a more developed bureaucracy and has more capacity to control such kind of crisis, then we saw a situation where the government just did what it knows where, the control and employing force to ensure that people remain where they are, the police and the other sectors, security sectors were heavily involved without having this European way of going about it. So in short, what the evidence used in Africa becomes very, it is not something that we can easily put our hands on, but as we saw that there was a lot of advisory, policy advisory. In Kenya, the president was very keen on getting advice from experts concerning what they should do about the situation. But in the end of it all, we cannot put our hands and find the data that was explicitly used to make particular decision, because also most of the decisions that were being undertaken were because of the recommendations of WHO, not necessarily internally generated. Now, when it comes to the kind of the data that Afrobarometer produces, our motto is let the people say, let the people have a say in what is ongoing in the country. So we are more so focused on the supply and the demand side of democracy. We just want to see what are citizens thinking about what the government is actually doing. And that's what the data is all about. So the manner in which the government uses things will depend on their own political motivation. It takes on the political parameters. I remember one day we called into parliament and the clerk, when we invited him to come and listen to our findings concerning different issues, it was like, oh, I don't trust Afrobarometer because I don't trust who is funding it. So that already informs the kind of data, whether it is good data, already the decision maker, the policy maker has an attitude on how who is funding that particular research, because he knows it is donors, then it's like we are tired of that kind of information. So it becomes very intricate.
Something like Afrobarometer could be a very good example of how to keep democracy going during the pandemic.
Right.
Yeah. Because it's different from just newspaper stories being generated from data that the government releases. So I think it's really interesting. And if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, so I think I have a slightly different take on this, but sorry, I'm a very centric person, so probably my training is speaking for me here. But one thing that I found that could really have an impact, but we weren't able to do, was this simulating these what-if scenarios, right? So my impression was that what policymakers were really wanting us to do was to answer these what-if scenarios for them, right? And this was not always possible because science and data science works in a kind of a different way, right? Because you have reality and you have data that it's already an imperfect representation of such reality, right? So what they really want is to act on the real world, right? But how we phrase our process in science is that, okay, you tell me what your question is first. And then we collect the data that we need to answer such question. And then we go on, right? It's like this, in medicine, it's very clear, right? First of all, you're running a trial. You want to know if drug A is more effective than drug B or whatever you have right now. You write the protocol. We're going to test exactly this, and this in this way, and we're going to collect at each time point this, and this. And the main outcome variable is exactly this, whether the person lives longer or not. Okay? Survival method. In policymaking, especially when you know under urgent circumstances, this is not often the case, right? They at the very beginning of the project, we got asked a lot of questions like, what is the policy mix that worked better? Okay, and then of course we came with other questions like, what does it mean work better, right? Or what is your primary outcome? Well, it's a combination of factors, as it should, right? So I think that this different process that the two disciplines or even epidemiology, right? When talking to policymaking, has kind of hindered the possibility of doing this effectively, right? And I also know of some examples. For example, Slovenia, we have a group of excellent data scientists that we work with very often, and they do have a grip on policy. They propose to have a couple of their own data scientists in such groups, right, to support and kind of, you know, work for free for along the lines of what Maria and her group did, but officially. And this was kind of pushed back. They said, no, thanks, you know, we like to do things different. But I think they meant well, but it's just I think there needs to be some alignment on the process of how these things work for really the communities to go up together. But I think that most of the work on modeling, especially agent-based or these kind of things, simulations, if we could answer to these what-if questions, that would go a great deal, both at the individual level. Should I go to work today or not? And to the more, you know, regional and national and possibly federal level. You could say, okay, what if France shuts it down and the UK and Italy doesn't? Or what if Kenya and Zambia shut down and Tanzania keeps going and producing food? This would, I think, would be kind of the link to get decision makers, either individuals or people taking decisions for others on both.
It's fascinating what you're saying, and then it suggests that we need to have these conversations about knowledge, epistemologies, kind of match into the next.
It's not a good topic. It's important. It's an important one to have. I agree.
Our government has something called the Magenta Book, which is the guidelines for how you do social research and social evaluation across the civil service, and it was written by basically complexity theorists. So it's really proposing the model for policymaking should look, the evaluation should look like something like RCT studies or the study of complex systems with Bayesian models. And because of that, things like my discipline is the qualitative social sciences are described in that text as too expensive, too imprecise, too situation and situation. Fundamental misunderstandings of social relations, actually. So we kind of need more of these multidisciplinary conversations that we're having today in order to actually act better and act in a more informed way in that pandemic. I know that there are questions from the audience, so I think I can take some questions now if there are some questions. I saw you put your hand up.
My name is Hindu. I'm a researcher from the Center for European Policy Study, CEPS. It's not quite a question, but rather an observation. So thanks for the fantastic discussion. And through that, I see that we have kind of coordination problem here between the public authorities working on public health, with the community representing the science, and then with the private sector. Like for instance, when I see that there's a distance between the science and policy making, and do you think it makes sense to have some kind of embedded community, like scientific community within the governance of the public health? And then between the public health and private sector, the case of the contact tracing is the excellent one. And do you think that for future crises, do we need to have a defined framework of working data between the government and companies, for instance, to like deal with cases like privacy?
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to say one thing which seems relevant here, which was to, you know, as an official, by the time it was working well, the absolutely most amazing public policy making process that I've ever seen within government was the process, and it was what I saw, so I'm not talking about other, but was the way in which SPI-M started working with officials. So the way in which the modelers actually, over time, both officials and modelers tuned into each other's way of working. And so that is, in a sense, a standing body of academics who are there and directly integrating into a policy-making process. Now, again, as was raised in the previous session, there's this question, well, what, you know, did they have an impact? They had a monumental impact in every detail, and every decision is a battle. Therefore, obviously, you know, it'd be naive to think that what the academy says the policymaker does, because, you know, you have to go and fight. But it's an unbelievable value, it was an extraordinarily valuable thing. And that actually, to my mind, raises another point, which is related to what you were saying, Laura, about, and you said, Maria, about interdisciplinarity and the difficulty of it. You highlighted how difficult interdisciplinarity is between extraordinarily quantitative disciplines. And then you get to, Laura, your ask, which is, why weren't we taking into account, or sufficiently into account, the sort of work that the SPI-B group were producing on what was happening in Leicester? Now, here you have two such fundamentally different epistemology. I mean, you think it's difficult getting economists, computer scientists, and mathematicians to talk, but, you know, at least we're in the same ballpark of being quantitative modelers. And here we have extraordinarily valuable knowledge, but that is not integrable easily. So I think that you're absolutely right to point to the importance of the Magenta book, because it's exactly where we've got to codify how we do this. And it seems to me that there's going to have to be, you know, it's going to take movement on both sides, as it were, to integrate that data into decision making.
So sorry if I'm check. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I disagree on one thing.
Yeah.
Not because I like disagreeing in panels. And that's the fact that the work we did is closer to a lot of the quantitative science and not so much to the qualitative science. And I actually disagree, because I think there has been, economics has long stand of like, we're quantitative, we know what we're doing, that's it. And the much I read about it, the much I'm like, I'd much rather read qualitative research, because I think they know what they're doing. They go on the field and they, you know, they actually know it. And we're talking about data integration, and now you're bringing behavior change, right? Like counterfactuals, they're important because you may have the data, but if people change the way they act, the data is not going to predict the future. So how do you know if people, if that will happen? Well, people that go on site and talk to them have a lot more opportunity to knowing this. So the tools we use is called agent-based models. They're simulations. They're quantitative, they're data-driven. But when it comes to the behavior, where I'd like to see myself in 5 years is talking with ethnographers, anthropologists, understanding the behavior, putting that in the agent-based models, and going forward. And this is why I really think we're not that far from qualitative research. We're not that far if we really try it and if we put the effort to communicate and talk into interdisciplinarity. Yeah, and I'd sometimes much rather talk with people that are open-minded, do qualitative, etc., than having people that think of themselves. I mean, I do think of myself as quantitative. I love data. I'm not going to move from that. But having sometimes this pushback between disciplines I don't like it. I'd really like to integrate it both
I'd
ways.
like to agree with you for just in some. What's really interesting is that when the modelers, these very high prestige modelers who were talking to being very influential, when they came and spoke to us on SPY-B and we started to talk to them about household behavior, these kinds of issues, they were absolutely gripped and fascinated and said, why can't we work with you? So what they were doing was working with the politicians and the ministerial with sort of in a self-referencing way of already a kind of hierarchy of knowledge of understanding complex systems. But if they'd triangulated as well, if we'd had more opportunity to be in the room with the modelers, the qualitative and 5D people, it could have transformed the way that those models were built. And I mean, that's why Maria's here on the panel. So how it works. There's obviously a lot more done. I don't want to try and have a capability to do it, but yeah, I think it's really important to not be prejudiced. And I think what was great about the interdisciplinary work that went on in stage was that because it was an emergency, we kind of lost all of our prejudices about the other disciplines, so to speak. And I think that's happened in the Periscope project as well. So yes, you want to? I don't want to.
I think that was a very good.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Luca. I'm also part of the Periscope project, together with the team and principal investigator for the CoronaNet project that has contributed data to the wonderful atlas. And my question is especially for Tony. So we have gathered 170,000 individual policies from governments, and still we are far away from having complete data, from having unbiased data. So especially in developing countries, our main source was Twitter and like kind of reports on Facebook, what happened. And so there was no official guidelines on when to provide such data. And even the WHO was actually shying away from trying to make it mandatory for countries to kind of contribute data, because they had the feeling that this would be a political issue, contributing data in itself. And so my question is, or I'm fearing actually that in, let's say, hopefully not, but 100 years, we will have the next pandemic and we have the same groups of people gathering the same data with like thousands of people helping them. And there was no progress made in terms of the willingness of governments to provide more data and to write data protocols that will prepare us for future pandemics. Maybe you, Tony, can give some insights on whether governments have realized that there's a big lack and how we could go around.
I mean, look, it seems to me that government is extremely aware of the challenge and the potential around data regulation, and our governments in the UK, EU, perhaps less in the US, less in China, are extremely concerned to make sure that data use and data regulation encompasses the question of legitimacy. And I think that a lot of the nervousness around, you know, data sharing for research purposes, etc., has come from the basic problem. I think as society, we haven't come to terms with what are legitimate uses of data and how do we control that they are being used in those legitimate ways. And I totally agree with you that one of the most important things that we can do in being prepared for the next crisis, whether it's a pandemic or any other crisis of that nature, is that we need to get on top of the use of data for public good, for social purposes. And that is going to require not, I think that it requires a little bit of thinking sideways. And I think this relates to your point about interdisciplinarity. We can't prepare for a crisis and wait for the crisis. We have to think, how are all the ways in which we need to get much more comfortable with ways of sharing data. Now, I guess I have a particular view of this, which is that the legitimacy problem is deep. It goes very deep. We have a lot of mistrust of public authorities with data. And some of it, I think, is quite justified, right? I mean, data is power, data gets misused. I think that we need to square the circle of mistrust and public use of data. My own view is that we do this by, in a sense, we need to think about the creation of new institutions that work for us in looking after our data, that we feel are our institutions, but that deal in a sort of mass way and a professional way and with the right resources in terms of representing our values around those data when it comes to their public use. So to be specific, I think that we should have something like data unions, which we can join, and that the data unions can then negotiate for their use in pandemics. And who would join a data use which says, no, you can't use my data for public health purposes? Well, a few privacy libertarians may well, and let us not have their data in there, right? We're still going to be able to do public health policy. But we need to have those intermediate institutions, which, because there is otherwise, and I think there was some of that in your data as well, that there is mistrust, and that mistrust isn't crazy. But we somehow or other have to extract the good, the public, the social good potential in the data while recognizing the limitations that can be put on its use. That's the great data task of the data policy task that we need to get right before we next need to use it in anger.
I really like the idea of data unions giving more activist sense in the agro-barometer kind of way, you know, the data rights, you know, and it's a wonderful counterpoint to the consumer rights that are very, very diverse. Unfortunately, I've got to bring this fascinating conversation to a close. We've been set many challenges. We've got to form data unions and get more interdisciplinary work. Modelers have to talk to them, scientists, and I'm sure some of that will happen just over lunch today. So great, thank you.
Oh, yes.
And that's what I'm doing. It's yes.
I like it. I go there. Oh, I certainly like to Tanzania. Yes, I went. I know